I would start the talk with, who here knows that we affect the brain? Chiropractors, that we affect the brain. We knew we must affect the nervous system, and that's where we started. And we started with a technique called somatosensory potentials, right up to the latest study we've done, where we're now published last year. We showed that the way that the brain talks to itself can change over 4 weeks of chiropractic care, and those brain changes correlate with reduction in anxiety and depression. The fact that these are linked with your mental health is quite a big thing, but it's coming out in the neuroscience literature, and now it's literally come out of one of these latest clinical trials, that the way your brain talks to itself is responsible for not only feelings of pain, but also feelings of anxiety and feelings of depression, and that can change over 4 weeks of chiropractic care. And that's exactly why I think the adjustment is so key.
Heidi Haavik, welcome to the Marketing Your Practice podcast. How are you, my friend?
Thank you for having me, Angus. I'm fantastic. Beautiful sunshine outside.
Well, same. Us both being kind of Southern Hemisphere kids at the moment here too. I know I'm speaking to clients over in Canada and through US, and they're in kind of feet of snow at the moment. And we had like 40 degrees yesterday. It was just sweltering kind of hot. In fact, you mentioned that you went back to the Netherlands for summer, for Christmas.
Yeah. I went home to my mum and dad. I grew up in Norway, so my mum and dad and brothers and everyone still live there, uncles, aunts, the whole family's back in Norway. I came out to New Zealand for a 6-month visit,
And
that's like...
We were talking about this last night, Lauren and I, with Mackenzie, our eldest as well. How old were you when you came out?
I was 20.
Yeah, right.
And I'm now 50. 51.
Yeah, I know.
So it's 31 years ago. I literally came out for a 6-month visit. Crazy.
Yeah, for a holiday, or what was the point of that?
No. It was sort of a working visit because, I was born in New Zealand and mum's a Kiwi, but my dad's Norwegian. So I came out wanting to sort of revisit my roots, and, it was a nannying job for 6 months, 5 months. And then I just did some waitressing and things like that. But when I landed, as the plane landed, Angus, I knew in the pit of my stomach, I was not leaving this place. I hadn't even touched down yet, but I knew. And then I found out about the chiropractic college and started the chiro college, and didn't really know. I had gotten into psychology, and I was thinking about medicine and things like that back home, because my dad's side of the family are all medics. They're all doctors and rheumatologists and specialists and physiotherapists. And I didn't really know the difference, because my mum's grandfather was one of the first chiropractors in New Zealand. Not the first, but he graduated in 1924. So he went over for 4 years and left his, wife and kids, which my grandmother was one of his daughters, and was away for 4 years, because only 2-year education at the time, but he had to work and send home money, for the family. Yeah. And then he came back and worked in Wellington. I mean, it's madness. So I knew that I had chiropractors in the family. So to me, chiropractors, physios,
When did you fall in love with the research side of things?
I think I've always had a really inquiring mind, Angus. I need to know. And I think I've just always been wired that way. I was one of those geeky students that sat in the front row and always asked questions, but how do we know that? Well, how does it work? And, so if I didn't have good answers, and I had a most amazing science professor, Bernadette Murphy, and she would literally admit to me, oh, Heidi, we actually don't know that. We actually don't know that. And so I kept asking the questions, and she kept saying, well, we don't actually know that. And I just adored her, because she was doing, PhD grade research in trying to understand better how the adjustment worked, and, what subluxations were and things like that. So my entire ambition with doing my postgraduate research was to help Bernie. I wanted to be her research assistant. And so I did all of this neuroscience just because I could. I have a brain that works that way. I've got a left brain and a right brain, and I was loving practice. I mean, I was fully booked. I had waiting lists in case I had a cancellation. I had little babies, and I just also had that left brain, and I could help Bernie. And I thought she was so amazing, and the work she was doing for the whole world was so important. So I just kept going. And then she left the country, and I was kind of stuck. I'd either have to give up on this research gig, and by then I already knew we were changing the brain, and I was so excited by it. I'd either give it all up, because you can't do research from your garage. You kind of need a tertiary institution. And then I was offered the job as a research director at the New Zealand College, and I'm like, oh, that's the only way I could actually continue doing it. And I kept saying, but I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I haven't even finished my PhD. I can't do this. And that was the day of Brian Kelly. And he was like, no, you'd be great. Come on, come on. And you know what he's like. You can't say no to Brian.
You can't. And Brian is the epitome of kind of ready, fire, aim. It's like you'll get ready along the way. Like you'll work it out.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
let's
yeah.
just make
And
it
he's so
happen.
inspirational, and I was like, yeah, yeah, I can do this. But only when he talked to me about it.
Yeah, he's a visionary. Fast
Mm.
forward to now. How many papers have you published? How many is
Oh,
your
I'm
name on?
actually not sure, but I think it's almost 90 papers. I actually went through my CV. I should actually know this, Angus, because I did update it in January. What are we up to now? Almost at the end of January. Anyway, I
Yeah.
found 5 extra publications that I didn't know I had. I mean, I
Wow.
knew them, but I'd sort of forgotten to add them to my CV. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, that. And then I had a lot that I had sort of written, submitted, and I hadn't updated that actually been published. So anyway, it's going so fast these days that I can hardly keep up with my own CV. I mean, that's quite embarrassing, really, isn't it? But it's
That's a
it's an
quality.
exciting time because you remember the days when I started out, and like each publication was like 3 or 4 a year. And it was like a massive celebration because it was so much blood, sweat, and tears. But it kind of goes exponentially. So it was slow, 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 slow. And now it's just like going so fast. It's insane. Yeah.
Yes. I really got exposed to your work at that stage. I was heading up the research department inside of Australian Spinal Research. And so we would have all
Yeah.
these work come in. And in essence, what it was is researchers around the world pitching for money to have their projects funded. And what always stood out about yours is it kind of matched the vitalistic philosophy that the foundation had, in that you seem to be interested in, what impact does chiropractic have on the brain? And then you've kind of run with that right the way through. I wonder if you could give, there might be some of our listeners that are not aware of all of your brilliant work. Can you spend the next little while perhaps summarizing where you began this journey and what did you find out? Like, what do we know now about chiropractic and the brain?
Well, we actually didn't know, Angus, that we affected the brain until our work. And I pinch myself about that because I've literally started the last year. I don't know how many 4 months I've been in the States alone, just giving talks last year, right? And plus Europe and everywhere else, Australia. But I would start the talk with who here knows that we affect the brain, chiropractors that we affect the brain. And like, there's at least 80% of the room put their hand up, you know. And then I ask, who was the first people or group or scientists that showed we affected the brain? And they haven't got a clue. And I
Mm,
go, it's actually us. It was us in New Zealand because we didn't know we were affecting the brain. We knew we must affect the nervous system, and that's
mm,
where we started. And we started with a technique called somatosensory evoked potentials, where you electrically stimulate a nerve, a mixed nerve, at very low levels. So it's sort of muscle spindle information from the hand going up to the brain. And then we were looking for changes at the spinal cord, right? Because we affect the spinal nerve roots. That's what we were thinking at the time, because that was the thinking up until the late 1990s and early 2000s, is that we chiropractors alter communication across the nerve root itself. So that's what we were looking for. But with that somatosensory evoked potential technique, there's also a couple of electrodes that you stick on the head. We only had 5 channels, so we could only record, like nowadays, we've got 64 channel whole head EEG setup, so it's very, very, very different. But back in those days, we only had 5 channels. So we were over the spinal cord, we were measuring brainstem, and then we had 2 extra electrodes that were over the primary somatosensory cortex and another peak that was representing early sensory motor integration at the brain level. And we had no changes in brainstem and spinal cord, and we had massive lasting changes in the cortex itself. So I knew from those early, early experiments in my PhD research that when we're adjusting subluxated segments, we're changing brain processing and integration. And so then started the journey. Well, what does that mean? Well, if that sensory integration is changing the way the brain makes choices and does something, we should change the motor output. to those same muscles in the hand that we were recording the sensory processing and integration from, right? So they were the very next studies we did, the TMS studies, where we're looking at how does the brain send messages to these particular muscles that we were previously with the SEPS technique recording the sensory processing and integration. And we were showing changes. So this is making logical sense now that when we adjust subluxations, you're changing the way the brain senses that information, processes that information, thinks about that information, and the way it makes decisions about what to do with it. And that's how it all started. We knew we were changing the brain. So then came the whole discussion around, well, if it's not nerve roots, because quite a bit of animal research showing that we're not actually changing communication across the nerve root, well, what is it about a subluxation that's altering the communication with the brain? And so then it started down that track, and then we discovered eventually that it appears to be the paraspinal muscles, those little muscles that cross individual vertebrae in the spine
Mm-hmm.
and the way they move. And what's fascinating then is you start looking at, well, what causes a subluxation? Well, we know that physical trauma, emotional trauma, or inflammation, so chemical trauma, trauma, toxins, and thoughts, who would have thought, can actually switch off those little muscles. So they stop the communication. And over time, those little muscles can atrophy and shrink and become stiff and fibrotic. And so now you're starting to get, okay, so it's not the nerve root that we're changing when we're subluxated, but it's the communication from these paraspinal tissues, particularly these small muscles across the vertebra that are subluxated and how they communicate. And they can, so then all of a sudden now we're discovering that a subluxation that's, say, created today from, say, you have an accident would probably be mainly neural, but a subluxation you've had for 2 years, now you've got atrophied, fibrotic little muscles that are no longer functioning, not communicating with the brain, and you've had 2 years of the brain not accurately interpreting what's going on around that segment of the spine. And it turns out, Angus, that that information is actually vital for your brain to be able to control movement, not just of the spine, but your arms and legs, how it interprets where sound and visual information is coming from, and so on. And so it's sort of getting bigger and bigger. And this is actually making more and more sense too, because you think about it, right? For your brain to know how to move an arm or a leg, well, it kind of needs to send that information according to where it attaches. And your arms and legs attach to the spine. So that spinal information turns out to be very, very important for you to be able to accurately move your body, your trunk, your arms, your legs, your head. And it's like, duh, when you think about it, well, that makes
Totally.
perfect sense, right? Because you can't send messages just randomly to an arm in isolation. It has to be that arm that attaches to that shoulder, that attaches to that spine. And so if you don't know what's happening at the spine, you can't send accurate information to the arms. And so what does that mean for people? It means that they might be a bit more clumsy. They might not be able to move their arms and legs appropriately. So that might lead to accidents and injuries and reduced
Yes.
sports performance. And so it's just snowballed and grown, like right up to the latest study we've done, where we're now published last year. We showed that the way that the brain talks to itself can change over 4 weeks of chiropractic care. And those brain changes correlate with reduction in anxiety and depression, as well as, aches and pains and things like that we've always known we're good at, right? But the fact that these are linked with your mental health is quite a big thing, but it's coming out in the neuroscience literature. And now it's literally come out of one of these latest clinical trials that the way your brain talks to itself is responsible for not only feelings of pain, but also feelings of anxiety and feelings of depression. And that can change over 4 weeks of chiropractic care. So it's getting really exciting because we're now also getting into clinical trials, not only measuring the brain function, but also measuring our immune outcome measures. And like this hasn't been done before either, even though
Mm.
pretty much probably you ask any chiropractor on the planet and they'll tell you that the immune system is affected under chiropractic care. But we noticed during the pandemic, we didn't have a single clinical trial. And that's that difference between, like, my world's always been the basic science and understanding what a subluxation is and what is the mechanism of an adjustment. But you got to link it to the clinical outcomes, as in what does it mean for our patients? So
Mm.
we're now connecting the basic science brain changes with these clinical outcomes. So we're kind of finally, after 25 years, sort of coming full circle, connecting it all, which is it's just so exciting.
I wonder if you could, because when I last listened to you speak with St. Ken's last year, you introduced me to the concept of, I think it's called the default mode network.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
that's the one I was talking about now. But
yeah,
yeah.
because that in terms of, and that's what kind of correlates with anxiety, depression, and self-experience and who we are and all those things there. Can you explain what the default mode network is,
Yep.
its importance in our sense of well-being,
Yeah.
and then kind of just tag back in that stuff that you were kind of realizing
It's, it's
with the
it's
research?
really fascinating. I mean, like it's like a new model of understanding consciousness, pretty much, that's come out in the
Yes.
last sort of 15, 20 years. It's not been around for a long time.
Mm.
So but the thinking is that, what we're consciously aware of is we're either doing something and then we're paying attention to a task. Then you operate in parts of the brain called the central executive networks. And networks just means regions of the brain talking to each other about a particular conversation. So there's certain networks that are active when we're paying attention to a task. Like, for example, if you're listening to this podcast right now, you would be operating in your central executive network, unless you're daydreaming. If we're boring, Angus, then you'd actually default down to the default mode network. But I'll get to that. But if you're actually paying attention to what we're talking about, you're operating the parts of the brain called the central executive network. It's got other names, but let's not bother about that. If, for example, the fire alarm went off where you are, it's still just a sensory input, but that sensory input is known to your brain to be, this is a salient signal. This is something I need to pay attention to. And so it's important for my homeostasis right now. So then your salience network would kick into gear. And that's a sort of like a life-saving thing.
Hmm.
It's like oh, I need to pay attention right now. It's still just it's a sound, right? But that sound, sensory information, if it's a fire alarm, is recognized by your brain as, this is important for my survival. I need to get out of this building right now. Right?
Hmm.
So it has an action associated with it. That's called the salience network. What's salient to me right now? It doesn't have to be a sound. It could be you see something. Someone could just come in front of you with a gun. Again, it's a visual input, but it's enough for you to go, oh my goodness, I've got to get out of here right now, right? Or whatever. It could be your stomach is playing up and you need to go to the toilet very urgently. It's just a sensory information, but it wakes your salience signal up. Salience network, I've got to go to the bathroom right now. That's all salience network. If you're not operating out of the central executive or the salience network, so you're in safety, you're not doing anything, what we tend to do is default. And we default to thoughts about ourselves. It's about us, how we're going, how we've done today, yesterday, the day before, how we fit into the world, how we fit into our family, our work environment, how we're regulating our own emotions. And for a depressed person, they can ruminate in their default mode network.
Mm.
So they go on and on and on about, oh, I'm so fucking useless. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I said that. They might have just said a slightly odd thing, but they would ruminate about it. And this has been shown, like that you have this excessive default mode network communications between certain parts of your brain within the default mode in depression. In anxiety, they just go on and on and on about what could happen. And again, it's not a rumination, because ruminations refers to the depression part, but it's that over catastrophizing, it's called. So you're
Mm.
constantly thinking the possibilities of what could go wrong, and you're making it into a much bigger problem. And again, that has been shown to be present, multiple studies in people with anxiety. And so what's fascinating is what makes up that default mode. And there's a lot about how we control our own emotions, and this is also linked with how we then physically control our body as well, because our thoughts and our emotions can trigger neural and chemical release of neurotransmitters and hormones that can change our physiology as well. And so this is why now it's known in the literature that people that think and feel and then go down a certain rabbit hole, which ends up ruminating and catastrophizing, end up with depression and anxiety. And
Mm.
it's linked with chronic pain. So it's really fascinating. If you start looking at the pain literature, it's way different than we used to think 20, 30 years ago, when we thought pain was a feeling to tissue damage. Now we know, especially chronic pain, is just something that's being kept alive by our default mode network. It's part of who we are now. It's become embodied. And again, there's a reason for that, because we know that if you go into the salience network, like if you were injured, you would obviously go into salience network that we talked about
Mm.
before. That is very energy consumptive. It takes a lot of energy to be in salience network mode, because you're in danger mode, right?
Yeah.
And so if it's an ongoing thing, which can sometimes last a while, it sort of becomes tied into our default mode and maintained by our brain's story about who we are and ourself. So the anxiety and the depression and the chronic pain are now known to coexist. They develop together and they coexist together. And so this is when it gets really fascinating, right? Because chiropractors have always been known to be really good at the pain thing, even chronic pain.
Mm.
But what we seem to be unpacking at the same time is the anxiety and the depression and how we're affecting our immune function and our neurotransmitter function and our hormone production and all of this as well. So it's a really exciting time in the research world, Angus, to you've been with me on that journey right from those early days with the ASRF studies to
Mm.
where we are today, where that spinal information, that spinal function is so much more important than most people realize. Obviously, chiropractors have known this, but now we're unpacking the physiology of it. And it's just so exciting. And the neuroscience of it.
So would it be fair to say that when I'm subluxated, I'm not getting an accurate representation of what the world is, and therefore I'm getting that information is feeding back into my default mode network, which
Yeah.
is creating a sense of myself that might not actually be accurate and then might
Yeah.
lead to it feeding into more rumination, more catastrophizing that might end up kind of depression and anxiety. And so
Yeah.
when we adjust somebody and we therefore give them a more accurate representation of the world, they're better able to have a default network that's based on a more, well, accurate representation. Is that a fair kind of summary, or have I missed out
100%
too
spot
much?
on. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting here is I actually think that the adjustment wakes up the salience network. And I think it's precisely because we're activating the salience network that we get into our default mode. Because it's like the default mode is like the cassette tape that, we have recorded in our own brain, but it's not easy to change that. That's actually quite tricky to change
Mm,
because it's a tape playing, right? Like, I mean, I'm obviously showing my age here because I'm talking about a
mm,
cassette tape that, maybe our younger generation wouldn't even know what it is. But, it's like pre-recorded. It's our story, like Bruce Lipton talks about this as our stories that we've created in our
yes.
mind from childhood. And we have a lot of those. But that's exactly why I think the adjustment is so key. And it's not because I mean there are neuroscientists out there that are trying to change the default mode or trying to change the brain. And like if they get a 2% change, they're delighted. We've shown changes sometimes 300%, 1,000%. Like it's insane. Something about that proprioceptive information coming from the spine, but having an adjustment, it's not an easy to do thing. Like you require two people, right? So, but what I
Yeah.
think it is, it's such a salient network that the brain goes, whoa, I didn't realize that was what was going on. And so it's rechanging its story because it's like, whoa, I thought that this was going on in the spine, and now I'm suddenly seeing that's going on, and that spine, which is the core of our body, well, it influences where we interpret sounds coming from, where we interpret visual information coming from, how we control our arms, our legs, our trunk, our head, our neck, right? It's actually quite essential for so many things that it's
Right.
like it's like you reset the program or the story about self. And what you might suddenly realize is, that I don't actually have a danger in my lower back. It was potentially just an inflammation from my gut. Or so I don't actually need to have the danger warning system going. And the danger warning system is obviously the pain system. We used to think it was tissue damage system, but it's not. It's a danger warning system. So if your brain doesn't know what's going on, there might be inflammation or whatever going on. It might just go, oh, there's a danger here. I'll make you feel chronic pain. I'll make you feel pain. But if suddenly you're getting this proprioceptive information from that part of the spine going, oh, there's actually no danger here. So I can turn off those pain signals. I can now more accurately interpret sound information, visual information, proprioceptive information from arms and legs. I can suddenly control
Mm.
my body movements better. All these little glitches in the system that weren't working, I can now feed forward, activate my core muscles again that weren't working before. And like it sort of resets itself, a bit like rebooting the computer.
And is there a thought that, from what you're saying, is that so when we have a subluxation, we have a joint that's not moving well, and there are changes to the muscular system around it. Does that have a different impact on the brain than an elbow that doesn't move properly?
Well, that's a very interesting question, actually, because in theory, like, because I've had these conversations with chiropractors as well, like, well, could you have an elbow subluxation? Well, theoretically, yes, you can, but it could come down to the spinal information seems to be more important than
Yes.
peripheral joints. And it even explains, there's chiropractors out there that only adjust the upper cervical segments, the top of
Mm.
the neck.
Mm.
and it actually makes sense now because it seems that all of the segments that we adjust are having that direct impact on the brain. So,
Yes.
like we used to think that, oh, if we adjust a T4, we're affecting the T4 nerve root and T5 nerve, whatever, and that's no longer the thought patterns according to the brain model. Like every subluxation is having that impact on the brain and the
Yeah.
brain's central awareness of what's going on inside you and outside you, and then changing around all these different programs and how it operates from that day onwards. So
Yes.
in theory, yes, you could have an elbow subluxation, but say you had elbow pain, Angus, and I
Mm.
just want I think it's very important we cover this. Say you have elbow pain. Well, I would not start with the elbow. I mean, unless the patient was absolutely convinced that it's the elbow, I'd maybe palpate the elbow and so that they're with
Mm.
me, that I'm taking it seriously. But if your brain doesn't know where your neck is, for example, or even your lower back, it's not necessarily sending the right messages to the muscles that attach around that elbow. So you
Mm.
could be pulling more on one side of the elbow, and then you're causing these micro traumas and you're causing inflammation around that area. And so eventually you could cause the danger system could go off and say, okay, I've got elbow pain. Even though
Mm.
there's no necessarily, not necessarily an injury to the elbow, but you've got this
Yeah.
chronic elbow pain. You adjust the spine and the subluxations in the spine, which means the brain now knows where the arm attaches. So then all of a sudden it can now start to send more accurate messages to the elbow. The elbow pain can go away by itself. And
100%.
that's quite key. But I'm not saying it's not possible to have an elbow
No.
subluxation and you needing to have that adjusted. And that therein lies that art. Like the actual
Yeah.
chiropractor is a scientist, a clinician, and an artist, and a
Mm.
businessman or woman, right? So this is where, the patients don't read the textbooks either.
No.
So they don't
And I
fall
think,
into nice categories. You've got to figure it out. And I think you've got to trust with your experience comes that gut instincts, and they aren't just gut instincts anymore. There's more neurons in your gut than there is in the spinal cord. So this is a
yeah.
whole nervous system of itself. But anyway, I'm
Yeah.
getting sidetracked again, as
No, you're
always.
not. And I think what the point I was trying to kind of expand upon, I mean, I don't know that there's any debate. And again, because a subluxation is more than just a stuck joint, but I don't think there's any debate that all of the joints in the body can become hypomobile. They can stop moving the way that they ought to. And we know that when a joint doesn't move, it increases its likelihood of osteoarthritis. It has neural function changes there in terms as well.
Yep.
But it seems to me in my reading that there's a difference in impact globally when that happens at the spine than when it happens at an elbow. And it would seem to me that there's a difference when that happens upper cervically than when it happens in other areas of the spine there as
Well,
well.
think
And
about
so,
the importance of the information coming from the spine can
yes,
impact the entire system because
correct.
every movement you need to make is related to that spine, whether it's
Yes,
a leg movement, a toe movement. But an elbow is going to be less influential on, for example, a big toe. Right. So
yes,
it could just be that it's just not as important. It could also be that there are more, no, because even there's lots of muscle spindles around, for example, hand joints, like
yes,
our hand muscles and our feet
yes,
muscles, and for example, and there's very lot of muscle spindles. There's little stretch receptors in the upper cervical musculature, paraspinal musculature, but all the way
yes,
down the spine, the multifidi muscles, again, they're very stretch sensitive because
yes,
they're supposed to tell the brain what's going on at that part, because the spine is so important to how you move the whole rest of the body, how you respond. How do you respond to a trauma? You need to be able to fight and flight. So again, everything relates to that spine.
mm,
Interestingly, though, under a stressful situation like a traumatic experience, those little muscles can be switched off. It's almost
yes,
like we need the big muscles now for the arms and legs to just, excuse my French, but just to be able
no,
to fight or to run like hell. So
yes,
I'm not going to worry about precision right now. I'm just going to worry about being able to run because I thought that was really quite interesting. I mean, we joked about it before, but trauma, toxins, and thoughts has always been what Didi and BJ talked about as causing
yes,
subluxations. And when we did this literature review in 2021, looking at what could switch off those little muscles closest to the spine and skull and set up that neural vicious cycle of what we now call a subluxation,
Mm.
is trauma toxins of thought. So you could go into fight and flight. And Lorimer Moseley and David Burke in their book Explain Pain literally say, I think it's on page 90. I mean, I'm such a geek, really, but they say
Wow.
when you can go into fight and flight, the bigger muscles get all the energy and the blood flow, and the little muscles can go to sleep, or what we neuroscientists call neural inhibition. So
Mm.
not only does a physical injury potentially cause a subluxation, but a psychological trauma can, psychological, spiritual, whatever. And another thing that we found in the literature is local inflammation. And it makes so much sense to chiropractors I talk to. Like I never forget this guy who had a tooth abscess, and he was just chronically upper cervically subluxated. I knew something was wrong because
Mm.
I mean I could adjust him, and within 20 minutes he was like it was just fully subluxated again, like just stuck, nasty.
Mm.
And once I got him to the dentist and we dealt with the tooth abscess, he went back to just normal spinal function again. And I also wonder, just thinking out loud, that maybe that's why the lower back is such a tricky area to rehabilitate or to work on or to improve the function of, because what's right in front of that lumbar spine is our gut. And so many people have a leaky gut. And of course, that's local inflammation, quite a
Mm.
lot of it. And it causes systemic inflammation. But it could be why the lower back is so much trickier to deal with than, say, for example, the neck, or the thoracic spine. We don't have that gut there that can cause all of that local inflammation that can happen to the lower back. It's just interesting. And I'm just always, as a scientist, thinking about possibilities.
It's fascinating, and we talked about my practice in the early days. I was fortunate more by mistake than by planning. Is I found myself in the library one summer break and pulled out one of BJ's green books and started reading. And prior to that, at the end of first year, I can remember going along to a lecture we had in philosophy, and it wasn't rather than actually being a philosophy lecture at RMIT, it was actually a chiropractic history lecture. And I remember thinking, why do I even need to know about these old people? Why are they relevant? And so there was a real push I had away from it. And when I began to understand philosophy, it gave me the context of where chiropractic fit in. It gave me a vision for what I wanted to deliver. And I built a really lovely practice on the back of that. But there was always something missing. There
Mm.
were conversations that I shied away from. The way I had to solve a lot of problems was through philosophy, which is very, very powerful. And then, if I go back 15, 20 years ago, at the same time, you popped up, James Chestnut popped up, and all of a sudden I went, fuck, there's science here as well. And I, I literally, Heidi, felt bulletproof. It was just such a lovely way to go to work where it, 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 it made a difference to my self-esteem in practice. I felt complete in the recommendations I could give to people. It shifted away there being a need to convince. It was like it was,
You don't have to sell anymore, eh? Yes.
no, it was so wonderful and so grateful. I'm so deeply in debt to, both you and James for those early days of doing that too. What role do you think that all the work that you were doing has in, because the nuts and bolts is, as chiropractors, we want meaning in our practice. We want to feel like we're actually making a difference.
Yeah.
Um, we want an income that reflects the work that we do. We deserve to have busy practices and lovely lives with that too. And we want it to be enjoyable as well. So what role does all of this stuff we've talked about have in helping somebody grow their practice, have more meaning and have a more enjoyable time?
I thought a lot about this, and like you, I loved philosophy. I actually studied classic philosophy at Oslo University before I even left, and came to New Zealand. It's why my daughter's called Sophie. It's the goddess of wisdom. And anyway, um, and because there's a really good philosophy book written by a Norwegian philosopher called Jostein Gaarder called Sophie's World. Not Sophie's
Uh-huh.
Choice, but Sophie's World.
Yeah.
Read that one. It's a fantastic book. Because what do we really know, right? And philosophy provides a framework of thinking. It's like the big picture of a puzzle piece, right? It's like this is what we think is going on. And to begin with, we used to think that we were communicating via the squash nerve root. So now we just check philosophy again can change that. So now we have,
Yes.
with the science that's coming along, we can change what that big picture looks like. So now we have a new model, or the brain model of chiropractic, right? It's still a model. And then what science does is it comes in there with certainty. It comes in with facts. And the way I like to look at, again, if we're going to this puzzle model, is the theory is the big picture on the back of the puzzle piece cardboard box, back in the days when we had actual puzzle pieces and cardboard boxes. Um, and what the puzzle pieces are the scientific studies. Now, those puzzle pieces should fit together with other puzzle pieces that other people have created, right? Now, if puzzle pieces don't fit, or they're not showing the picture that you're thinking it is, there's two things that could be wrong. The puzzle piece could have been done wrong, faulty, could it be a faulty study, or it could be that the model that we're thinking is not
Mm.
actually correct. So, and this is what a scientist's role is to create bulletproof puzzle pieces so that and sometimes you have to do them several times to make sure, yeah, no, it's definitely that's definitely the right puzzle piece. And then they need to fit together into the bigger picture, and it all needs to make sense with what the cardboard box, is it matching up with what we thought, right?
Mm.
And if it's not, if the puzzle pieces are solid and they're showing a different picture than the cardboard box, we need to change the cardboard box. Like, because maybe there's
Mm.
a slightly different model and we didn't realize. And so that's how I've gone about. I've always been following the data, making sure the puzzle pieces have been done properly and correctly, and then try it with a different technology that should really show the same thing, but with a different, technology and methodology. And if it's showing the same thing, then that puzzle piece is more accurate than the cardboard box. That's why we needed to change it from a nerve root pressure model to a brain model.
Mm.
And what that provides chiropractors, if they follow this, because some people get very stuck in the old theory and want to just live with the old cardboard picture no matter what. And
Mm.
that's not necessarily ideal, right? Because ideally we need to be a little bit flexible with what science is showing. Science can also screw things up. So it's not one or the other. But once you've got 20 years showing one thing, you kind of got to go with it. And so if you then follow the model and you're willing to shift a little bit with what the latest theories are showing us, and you can use the science, it provides a hell of a lot of certainty and clarity in our communication. And that impacts our business of running a chiropractic practice in a very big way. Because your certainty and your clarity in your communication, your
Mm.
confidence in your communication have a real big role to play in a booming business. Because we
Yeah.
know that from other psychological research, behavioral research, that someone who is passionately, confidently, clearly communicating a story, and that only comes when you've got that certainty. You said it beautifully before that you had a theory, but you didn't have the certainty. You shied away from certain conversations. You don't need to anymore. Like, that's
Yes.
the beauty of it. We sat at the college the other day and we had the most amazing conversation, Angus, about frequency of care. I mean, in the
Mm.
past, we only had our own clinical experience to go on. Well, now
Mm.
there's evidence. There's evidence
Yes.
that suggests that if you actually get adjusted more frequently, both from a mechanisms perspective, but actually from outcomes research,
Mm.
are all showing that, like, what we're really doing is exercising those little muscles around the spine back into proper
Mm.
function so your brain can actually perceive what's going on. And funnily enough, we actually need to exercise those muscles more than once a month.
Yes. Surprise,
If you want to
surprise.
improve that function of the spine, more frequent care early on is really good. And then maintenance care is good. And that's backed up now by science. But still, at the end of the day, like, I'm a real lover of that evidence-based model, that you share the science, you share your practical clinical experience and expertise, or the expertise of others. And at the end of the day, it's the patient's choice. It's your health, mate. I'm here for you. The science says that, more frequent care early on, and I can explain why. And the science shows that after that initial period that, maintenance care actually works better for you in the long run. But, it's your choice. It's your
Mm.
health. People know that they should exercise, but they don't necessarily do that either. So,
Totally.
yeah.
And I think that was a great realization for me too. Just, there are a lot of things that people can be doing for their health that they're not doing, that are scientifically supported. There's a number of people out there that
Uh-huh.
know they shouldn't be smoking, and giving people choice and being there with them on their journey. But I think, coming back to this idea of, certainty, clarity, and confidence, I think we have to realize that, as humans, we have really sophisticated perception radars that when you're communicating to me, if there is a lack of certainty, clarity, and confidence, regardless of what words that you're saying, I'm going to pick up on that. And
Oh,
that's
yeah.
going to impact whether I say yes or no, whether I
Yep.
book my next 12 weeks of appointments in
Yep.
advance or
Yep.
not. And, you know, and so it's incumbent on us as chiropractors to make sure that we have all of this. There needs to be I'm going to say a reality check.
I know.
Um, and we'll talk about that in a moment there too.
People have a
To
big bullshit radar.
exactly, that's a fancy way for
Well,
what I was
because
trying
I
to
mean,
say
it
before.
really is the same thing in people's minds because it might just be that you're not 100% certain, but or that you're not very clear in your communication because of a lack of certainty or lack of knowledge even nowadays, because
Mm,
now there actually is the knowledge. But like the people listening to you will be going, well, why aren't they sure? Why don't they know? I reckon this is bullshit. And then they could just pull away, which is
mm,
exactly what you were talking about. And
yeah,
it's not that you are bullshitting them necessarily, but you might just not be certain yourself, or you
yeah.
might not have delved into the science and sitting there going, wow, I mean, it actually fits perfectly with my philosophy. So the model and the science all fits hand to hand. And because if you have read this science, like I know you have, Angus,
Yeah.
like you are left with, like I can go on stage in front of any audience anywhere, and I have utter utter certainty. I know exactly what we know and what we don't know. I know
Mm.
what is theory and what is not theory. And I could talk in front of neuroscientists, doctors, neurosurgeons, politicians, kings and queens. I wouldn't give a fuck. I know exactly what we know and what we don't know. And I think that's very obvious, right?
Yeah.
That
It,
certainty I have and the clarity that I have. And you don't
yes.
necessarily need to be me because you said beautifully, like there's many people I meet that can almost communicate the science, I think, better than me.
Well, I think being humble with regards to that too, because I think and I've watched over these 15 years has you have developed your skills as an entertainer, a communicator. The passion has always been there as well. I just can't get enough of it. If our so hopefully this episode has been enough to whet the appetite. And if people want to kind of find out more, and I mentioned you wrote a book called The Reality Check.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
how do people like dive into the world of Heidi and upskill themselves in this so they can have some of that, certainty, clarity, and confidence that you and I have been speaking about?
So the book The Reality Check is probably a good start because it will give you an
Yeah.
overview. And we even use that still to this day, even from master students in bioengineering or
Okay.
neuroscience students or PhDs that come over, even professors and postdocs, anyone that comes and joins our team, we give them the reality check because it's written in lay language. So even if it's not your field, even if you're a PhD, but it's not your field, you can
Mm.
understand our model, where we're coming from. So it's still really relevant. It's been translated in, I don't know, 9 different languages. Norwegian, coming out
Really?
in Norwegian now soon. I know, it's unbelievable.
Wow.
Anyway,
I
I've
didn't
just had
know.
it translated into
Congratulations.
Japanese. But
Nice.
anyway, so there's the reality check. That's available at HeidiHaavik.com or as an ebook, or it's available at Amazon and multiple different Amazon countries where it's translated. Um, but we've also created a whole lot of online classes for
Mm.
chiropractors and a whole lot of resources for chiropractors to communicate this science to their patients. So if you want to communicate the facts, we've got all of this translated materials. So all of that you can find at chiroshub.com.
Yes.
The actual platform where we keep all the classes for chiropractic is called Chiro's Academy, but best place to go is chiroshub.com.
I'll
And
have
chiro's
all the links,
plural.
yeah, in the show notes that we can kind of check that too. And I want to two things. I want to encourage people because what can sometimes happen from this is that people can hear you and I talking and then they can go to their patients the next day, hey, did you know that chiropractic adjustments change your brain? And that will be helpful for you to do that. And borrowing that certainty, clarity, and confidence from Heidi and I in this conversation is one level for you.
Yeah.
It's different. I don't just stop here. Like, eh, get Heidi's book. Um, Look at her other resources there as well. I've worked with numerous clients that love them. We've used, them. It's beyond powerful. And uh, on top of that as well, the other thing that we should be doing is that Heidi's work, and we were saying beforehand, there's 47 projects happening this year. There's now a staff of 30 plus people that are of all different kind of backgrounds. And all of this needs to be funded
Yeah.
and so we need to support that. as well. And when you buy a
That's
book,
massive. Yeah, that is
um,
really massive. Yeah.
yeah. So, you know, when you do this and you learn this and your practice gets busier, please give back to the spot that kind of helped you with this as well. So, I want to uh, just say my most sincerest thanks, Heidi, for because I've watched you go through this. I've watched on as a caring friend, and I've seen a tiny impact of what it does to you and your well-being, to travel from one place to another, to time zones, to time away from family, to all those things there too. And I know that I'm guessing it doesn't come at no expense. And I want to
Yeah.
thank you for all of that sacrifice as well, and to let you know it doesn't go unnoticed. It's
Almost going to
greatly
make me cry,
appreciated.
Angus, because I know you've seen it. And I know you've seen a lot of it too. I'm in a complete burnout there in the middle. Yeah. No, it
Yeah,
wasn't easy. It's not been an easy journey. I mean,
no.
you got to be pretty mad to really do what I've done, but
What
but
it
you know,
takes a special
my
person.
journey, my
Yeah,
journey. I was meant to do
totally.
this. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, there too. So, I'll leave you with any last thoughts here as well. Anything else that you'd like to kind of share with our audience? Exciting stuff coming up. Synopsis of what we've chatted about as well.
I think I'd like to leave you with just remember how important what it is that you have in your hands, hearts, and minds. Like what you do matters. And what we're finding in the research is that that adjustment, correctly applied at a subluxated segment has such a profound impact on that central nervous system for that human being. It's rather remarkable. Like in one study, we showed that the single adjustment session is equivalent to the changes in the nervous system as 3 weeks of strength training. Like, I don't think you chiropractors quite recognize the power you have in your hands.
Mm,
And just because you don't necessarily see massive changes immediately, like it takes time. And other studies we've shown that, some of the changes in the nervous system took between 4 and 12 weeks to show up. So don't expect a miracle every single adjustment, although it's actually happening there. And so I think that's really important. Those of you who are practicing in Australia might be really excited to know that we're starting our first newborn baby study, and I can't wait. We're looking at the outcomes of the babies, so their clinical outcomes, as well as the brain changes, because what we know, those babies, all the babies that come and see us, right? They're usually the babies that can't breastfeed on one side or can't turn the head one way, or they've got torticollis or colic, and we know that the trajectory of these babies, if they don't get care, is pretty devastating. It's pretty
mm,
disgusting. And yet, and I know in Australia you guys get, labeled as dangerous for babies. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So I
mm,
just I just wanted to highlight that right next door in New Zealand, we're starting a PhD project through Auckland University. It's really amazing. The most super bright woman, she's doing it, Jenna Dewar, as her PhD. And if you wanted to support that, because you know how important it is that we get access to these kids and can change their life trajectory from a misery to, thriving, and you know that if you've practiced with babies, right? That's one of 47 projects that we've got that are chiropractic relevant on the go at the moment. And I'm, currently working on, what is it, 12 papers I told you from those three projects. And that's not even counting this one. So there's an amazing amount of work going on, and I'd love it if you would consider, and it doesn't mean that you need to give us money, but maybe you know a person that's benefited from chiropractic care that might be willing to give a little bit for chiropractic research. And there's multiple ways you can do it, whether it's directly through the research centre at the New Zealand College of Chiropractic, or it's through Australian Spinal Research Foundation that supported us tremendously, always have. Or
mm,
if you're in the US and you're listening, there's the NCMIC Foundation or the chiropracticfuture.org. Just check out any of these organizations, and there's probably many more too that support the kind of work that we're doing, and now many others are doing as well. So it's exciting times to be a chiropractor, where the science is finally explaining the philosophy and backing up basically what you chiropractors have always known to be true.
mm. And the world is coming at us at an incredible rate of knots, where they're shifting over to these vitalistic, looking at nerve system first approaches as well. So,
They
gang,
need us
get
more
on
than
board.
ever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Heidi's the
Yeah.
best. Gorgeous. Thank you so much for today. There are so many things we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about your stroke research. We haven't talked about all that
I
stuff,
know. I
which
know.
just means there's
We'll have to do
another
another time.
reason for us. Please, yes,
Yeah.
later on in the year, let's
Yeah.
come back as well. Thanks for everything.
Awesome.
See you
Thanks,
soon.
Angus. Lovely to talk to you. Love to learn.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching Program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.